It has been 72 hours since Bashar al-Assad and his regime in Syria came to an abrupt end when rebel forces captured Damascus, forcing him to flee to Moscow. And it has been a long time coming. The uprising in Syria started peacefully in March of 2011, nearly 13 years ago. But when the Assad regime brutally cracked down on it, it led to militancy and a civil war that tore up the country. I covered it. I went there. In 2012, nearly a year into Assad's crackdown, I traveled to Daraa, the heart of the uprising, for NBC News, and I saw firsthand how the Assad regime treated people.
Even on this busy street, people wouldn't speak to us, saying it was too dangerous. But others off camera told us what life is really like. This man leads us away from government minders and into a narrow alley. We promise not to show his face. He shows us gunshot wounds suffered during the protests and tells us a different story than what government officials have been saying.
To be honest, part of me, like many others, still can't believe that Bashar al-Assad was actually toppled after so long. On the other hand, it is worth looking back and asking a different question. Why didn't this happen sooner? Why did it take this long for the Assad regime to collapse? Why did the world let it go on for so long? Back in 2012, a year into the uprising, then President Barack Obama gave this famous warning to the Assad regime.
We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
But when Assad crossed that red line and actually used chemical weapons on civilians in 2013, President Obama changed course and sought to get approval from Congress for a military strike in Syria. He was ultimately met with bipartisan opposition in Congress, with members saying that the war in Syria did not pose a threat to the United States. In the UK, then Prime Minister David Cameron similarly went to the British House of Commons to make his case for authorizing force against Assad's regime for their use of chemical weapons. But this resolution failed 272 to 285 with votes from members of Cameron's own Conservative Party. With the U.S. sidelined, the failure to enforce a red line against Syria arguably gave Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah a green light to fill the void and drag the civil war into a very different direction. Which brings us to today. Here we are at a crossroads once again where wrong decisions are being made in the Middle East in real time, this time by America's closest ally in the region, Israel, against a nascent Syrian government still taking shape. Since Assad's collapse, Israel has launched a sweeping aerial campaign and ground invasion with at least 350 airstrikes being leveled against military assets across Syria, taking out the Navy, fighter jets, drones, tanks, air defense systems, weapons plants, and a wide array of missiles and rockets, according to the Israeli military. Now, presumably, the new Syrian government that wants to preserve its territorial sovereignty and security is probably going to want some of those military assets to maintain control of its countries and borders, will it not? In addition to the airstrikes, Israel has now launched a ground incursion into Syria and illegally seized and now occupied territory. Israel claims it is doing so temporarily and preemptively in self-defense. But decades ago, Israel illegally occupied Syrian territory in the Golan Heights, land it would go on to illegally annex till this very same day. Now think about this. America's closest ally in the region is bombing Syria heavily without any consequence and effectively weakening and defanging a state that we here in America want to succeed, that we want to be sovereign and independent and free of foreign interferences, whether that is from Iran or Russia. How long is the new government in Syria going to simply sit by and watch Israel launch strikes against them and take more land? What is the advantage of doing this other than defeating and weakening a state that is reeling from more than a decade of civil war? How does a weak Syria that cannot even secure its own borders, defend its territory, benefit America's national security interests? Here's what the UN Special Envoy for Syria had to say about that earlier today.
We are continuing to see Israeli movements and bombardments into Syrian territory. This needs to stop.
Joining me now is Samar Ali, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. Samar, it's great to see you again. Let's start with the strikes and incursions that we are seeing in Syria from Israel. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, told NBC News that Israel does not intend to stay in Syria permanently, but will not allow the Iranians to return to their borders. You and I know, obviously, till this day, Israel occupies the Golan Heights illegally against international law. Could this be the beginning of something similar?
It could be. I think we have a lot of could-be's. There's a lot of scenarios to explore right now. There's a lot of things that are live and in action. It's a very dynamic environment that we're all witnessing in real time, as you said as well. Like, you're still wrapping your head around the fact that Assad is no longer in power after all of this time, and the Assad regime has fallen after over 50 years of ruling. And I think that we need to go back to basics here, and we need to think about what does a rules-based international order actually look like? We do not want to see a sovereign state like Syria being attacked by any state right now, whether that be Israel, whether that be Turkey, whether that be Iran, whether that be Russia. Israel has attacked, as we know. It has attacked over 150 times over the past 24 hours. And as you mentioned as well, whose interest does a weak Syria serve? It certainly doesn't serve the United States' interest. It doesn't serve many democratic nations' interest. It doesn't serve, again, an international order, if that is what our interests are. We know that Syria is of a strategic interest in the region, and a strong, stable Syria will be good for the entire Arab world, and quite frankly, it will be good for the entire world. So we need to invest in those steps that are going to lead to a stable, strong Syria rather than an unstable, weak Syria. And keep this in mind, too. Violence breeds more violence. What really concerns me, too, is if Israel goes in and starts annexing land or starts creating a further destabilizing environment, that can also invite more and other countries to do the same. And we're going to have another proxy war in Syria instead of what the Syrian people are calling for, which is peace, which is unity, and which is consistent with our own interest around human rights and democratic values.
Let me get your thoughts on other developments involving Syria. This from the White House. Two current administration officials and a former senior U.S. official told NBC News today that the Biden administration is exploring removing the foreign terrorist designation for HTS, the most powerful of the rebel groups that unseated Bashar al-Assad. What do you make of this development, and what could it mean for Syria? Is it a good or positive step to do so?
I think it is a positive step to do so. And I think it's, again, the United States showing an interest in a stable, strong Syria, one which has indicated it wants to rebuild. It is crying out and saying no to more violence. It's saying enough. It's saying it's saying to the world, we want peace. We want to break the cycle of violence. We want to break the cycle of trauma. And what we're interested in is the world believing in us as we are believing in ourselves. And we want you to invest in us. We want to become open for business. We want a different tomorrow than what our dark past over the past at least half century has looked like. And that requires removing the sanctions. It requires different designations for different groups which have shown and continue to prove that they have evolved and they don't want violence, that they want peace. They want to join the rest of the world and to seek for freedom, for prosperity, for a better tomorrow for their children. And what this requires, I'll just say three things. And I think that this is what we want to help invest in. We want to invest in the stability rather than in an escalation of more violence. And that stabilizing process, which is critical during a transition, which is what we're in right now, is the following. They need to establish a credible transitional authority, a transitional government that's going to govern during this transitional period. The second thing that needs to happen is they need to establish a constitutional declaration of principles that's going to guide this period as well. And the third thing, which is really critically important and time sensitive, is they need to act and show their ability to deliver in ways that allow for international aid to be able to come in, for the currency to be stabilized, for the economy to be open for business again, and to start showing some wins and getting some positive scores on the scoreboard that peace is possible and peace is delivering, and that violence is not inevitable, and that there's another path here than violence. And that also requires stability on the streets and to manage a de-escalation process so that we don't see a lot of chaos, which is what we can tend to see during a transitional period.